great-grandfather was a rabbi in Germany, in Rastatt, near Baden-Baden, and he used to go into the hills walking with local parish ministers in the early 20th century in Germany, of all places. And I suppose something often developed within me as a sense of which there is a great importance in how we relate to the society around us. And so as a rabbi, I always valued how we as a community, as a people, relate to the wider society. So yes, of course, in our own communities, we value our education, we value halakha, education around the Torah, religious obligation, religious practice. But I felt that we needed to think really carefully about how we relate to the world outside. And so while I was at Kingston, I got very involved in interfaith work there. In Muswell Hill also, as Spencer said, I founded a multi-faith network there to bring the diverse groups together in Haringey, and to try and think together on the issues that affect us all. And that led me to look for work outside. So I'm one of those rabbis that moved out of the rabbinate, of course, of which there are a number. That's another talk. Although many of those synagogues have since filled their spots, which is really good. I didn't dislike being a rabbi. I enjoyed being a rabbi. I felt it was very positive years, but I felt that I was, I suppose, still young enough in a way to be able to branch out and do other work. And I'd always been interested in this organization, JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. I've been interested in an organization that would think it important for us to stand with other minorities against forms of racism. I brought their head, Edie Friedman, she American woman, who founded JCORE in 1976. So she ran the organization till much more recently, till a year ago. So in the 46 years at the helm. And this was a time, of course, the late 70s and the 80s, where there was more open racism on the streets of our country and against black communities in London and outside London. And so there was a lot of work to do. Things in some ways have changed. Maybe racism is less, in some ways, certainly in some of the communities, overt than it was, much more sort of gone inside, gone indoors, so to speak. Although we, of course, are seeing in the last few weeks since the 7th of October, a dramatic rise in open anti-Semitism, and also Islamophobia as well, in the wake of what's happened. So racism is clearly an issue. So that's a bit about my journey. A journey which took me from Scotland to the London School of Economics, to Israel, to Kingston, to Muswell Hill, and now here I am in the holy Edgware, down the road from you all, talking to you, of course, at Edgware United Synagogue. The rabbi who preceded me at Muswell Hill was a rabbi, I'm not sure you've ever heard of him before. He's called Rabbi David Lister. I don't know if you know him. Hands up if you don't know. Absolutely lovely man. Yeah, if he's not here, then certainly send my love to him, because he's a super person. So that's a little bit about me. So the organization, I applied to be their executive director. So there are two facets to this organization. One is JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, which is an organization that was primarily about fighting racism with other communities, a Jewish voice on racial issues, but also pivoted a bit to starting to work with refugees and asylum seekers. It set up a program, which we're now actually expanding, for people who want to befriend unaccompanied young asylum seekers. So people who find themselves here between the age of 16 and 25, we have a program where you have a year. You can meet every 2 weeks. This isn't about housing the individual. Every 2 weeks to meet, to help, fill in forms, applications, advise, mentor, give the individual more confidence. We're also trying now to bring together lawyers in the asylum and immigration world, Jewish barristers, Jewish lawyers, to try and support some of our clients, these asylum seekers, in cases that they have in their legal support. Legal support is very hard to come by. The legal aid structure has been diminished quite a lot. Pro bono work isn't easy in the asylum case work, but we're working hard to sort of try and extend and expand the number of lawyers we've got so that we can actually match up lawyers with asylum cases. And we actually had that last week. We literally had a Hanukkah miracle where one of our lawyers had a legal aid case. The individual didn't need the support or had gone somewhere else, so he had a case. I immediately that day, by chance, said, we have a case, one of our clients are young people that we're supporting. And he said, well, I've got it, the legal aid case, I'll use it, and I can use it on this person. And so we were able to match up a lawyer with a person. That's great. So this job program we're really proud of, but we have over the last 2 years combined with a very big American organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. It was founded early 20th century in the United States of America. Its real reason initially was to support Jewish refugees from the pogroms, from the Shoah, from the Soviet Union. And then it realized later in the 20th century, early 21st century, that there were very few Jewish refugees. Ironic today, because of course we have Jewish displaced people now today living in Israel, people who are displaced from the south of Israel. But across the world, the refugee crisis is not Jewish people. Yes, there are Jewish people who will be displaced from Ukraine, let's say, but not as Jews, probably more as Ukrainians. And so HIAS realized that it had a role to play as a Jewish organization, not just helping Jewish people, but as a Jewish presence and a Jewish voice helping others. And so HIAS started a strategy to be present in countries where there were large refugee populations. And so now you have a situation where HIAS is in about 22 countries across the world. We're talking about Chad, Kenya, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Aruba, Greece, Moldova, Poland, Europe. There are a number of places because of the Ukrainian, obviously, influx. My mother-in-law is actually working for HIAS in Poland, helping Ukrainians in Lodz, where my in-laws live. So that's now HIAS. It's a big organization. It wants to become global rather than just American. And therefore, we are the HIAS presence here in this country. Now, what we're going to do with that is three things. Firstly, what I want to do in this organization that I'm now running is to advocate as a Jewish organization for refugees and asylum seekers. So what I'll soon do is come to what they are. We can talk about what they are and who we're helping and who we should be batting for, so to speak. But it will be what we call advocacy, i.e. getting together with other organizations in the refugee sector and working with them to support them in bringing about a better situation, a more dignified situation for people in this country who are refugees or who are seeking asylum in this country. The second thing we want to do is to create more of a Jewish movement, create wider support in the Jewish community. And I think that can be political, if you will, and cross-denominational. That can be people in Orthodox and non-Orthodox communities. It could be people, whether they are, I suppose, what I would call small c conservative, people who vote conservative and are moderate, which I think is probably a very good way of looking at a lot of Jewish people. I probably think that probably would say, I think there's probably work done on this by the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, that most Jews support. So I just look at that. My background is interesting because I've tried to fit my logo on and it's failed. And I realize it looks like I'm representing the Red Cross. So just so you know, I'm not representing the Red Cross here tonight. That's the plus sign between HIAS and JCORE. Just to get that straight anyway. At least I won't put my finger up like that BBC reporter did when she started started the BBC anyway. So yes, so advocacy is one thing. Then building a sort of positive narrative in the Jewish communities across it. People can be supportive of refugees for many reasons. And I'll come to that in a second why. And the third thing is we want to create more volunteer opportunities for people in communities to support refugees. So obviously we have our befriending program. And again, I can put my, I'll do it now. What I will do is in the chat, let's just get the chat up here. Why can't I see chat? I can see it now. So I'm going to put now in the chat my email address, which is david.mason@hiasjcore.org. You're all allowed to write to me except Malcolm Cowan. He's definitely not allowed to write to me because he's mishpocha, you know, like and he supports Man City, so definitely can't do that. But no. So that's my address, david.mason@hiasjcore.org. You can also, if you want, in the chat, put a question. If there's something you want to ask, write it in the chat, and I'm happy to. I'll be looking at it and I'll see it there. So do write to me. For instance, if you're interested in befriending, if you're interested in volunteering yourself, there's a simple form to fill in. We will discuss what you need to do. We will offer training, not onerous, a one-off session of training. And we have referral pathways of vetted young asylum seekers who you can then build a relationship with, and we will sort of monitor or support throughout the program. But I would like to add to that. So I, for instance, have really been interested in getting synagogues, for instance, to have groups of people who will then support local families who are refugees. And I think we're also talking about, interesting, beyond Ukrainians, because we've done some great work about Ukrainians, but there are lots of people here who are refugees from Syria still, who come over from Afghanistan and other places who, yes, it might not be that we need to have them in our house living. It's often hard. It's not sustainable. But imagine a shul somewhere, wherever in this country, where there are Jewish communities, building a group of 10 people who together will support, let's say, 2 or 3 local families. And that could be a really good wraparound support that adds to what the council and hopefully the government does as well. So that's 3 things there: advocacy, building a Jewish sort of movement of support. Not everyone has to agree with what we're saying, but I also don't want to be so radical and so far left, I suppose, is one way of putting it, that most people won't like what we're saying. So, for instance, I'm not coming here to say we should open our borders and let everyone in. Everyone, come on, everyone should come to Britain. Firstly, that's just not going to happen. If you look at the numbers, it's just not. And secondly, every country should have an understanding of its own borders and its own self. So I wouldn't say that. So what about our values? So we have looked at 4 values, and these have representation also within our religion. Some of them are probably more universal than others, but as a Jewish organization, the first thing for me is compassion. The importance of having compassion for the other. And I think actually, even though we often talk about mercy as being the thing, right, having mercy on people, rachamim, we say in Hebrew. Then the problem with rachamim, with mercy, is that it's almost like, someone's been really bad, you have mercy on them, you don't punish them. That's God. God is merachem, meaning that rather than punish, he wants to let go. And that's not really relevant for this. I think about the case of Jonah. If you think about Jonah, at the very end of the book of Jonah, Jonah is very upset. He is sitting under this castor oil plant, which then dies. And God uses it as a message to Jonah of, if you took compassion over that plant, which is here today, gone tomorrow, should I not have compassion over all the people of Nineveh, right? Because, of course, God creates us, the humanity. We are all people of God in the sense of creation. And therefore, when you make something, it matters to you. So if we are, in a sense, acting in the image of God, the sense here is that we should feel compassion for people. Not in the sense that they'd get away with bad, with evil, right? And that's, of course, another discussion. Especially in the context of the conflict today in Gaza. But I'm talking about here people who are running from conflict. And we know that conflict is growing. political commentators are talking today a lot about how conflict is growing. We are living in a pretty unstable world now, where Russia is obviously stronger, or at least trying to be stronger, flexing its muscles militarily. We worry about China, and obviously with North Korea, with Iran, and then we have the countries of order, right? I suppose you can call them. Countries that don't want radical conflict, like America and Britain and Europe, and probably, yeah, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and some of these countries that rather want agreement than fight. And so in that world, there are conflicts where people had to leave. So, in the Syrian conflict, most of the population was displaced. Most of the population either was displaced internally, i.e., they left their home and moved somewhere else within Syria, or left the country altogether, either to a neighboring country or farther away. So we need to think about this. And many will say that the fear is that added to persecution, conflict, war, will also be climate refuge. So if I have to leave a country because it's not tenable to live there, because the economy has collapsed because of climate, am I now, and I'm not answering this for you, but I'm throwing it out, am I now a refugee? Should I now be, in a sense, have our compassion as someone who seeks to live somewhere else because where they live is not tenable? It's quite funny. I went to COP 2 years ago. You remember that? You have these like chat shows every year at a different country, where we talk about how to agree exact language as to how we protect the climate. And 2 years ago it was in Glasgow. So I went to Glasgow, and there's a massive sign there, COP26. So I'm like, I'll get a picture in front of that, send it to my synagogue. At least they think I'm doing something, I'm not mucking around. You know what I mean? So I stand there, and this entourage comes towards me. I'm thinking there's someone important here. So I said to the guy in the middle, so what do you do? He says, well, I'm the president of the United Nations. I'm like, hey up, God. Okay, now this isn't the director general. This is the voted president. But he was also the foreign minister of the Maldives, and he had been on Newsnight saying that his country, was underwater. Will eventually be underwater. So people living there will need to live somewhere else. So climate refuge is already something that people are thinking about. So that's compassion. Second, we talk about responsibility. Responsibility, and what I mean by responsibility is this. There's a midrash or a story in the Talmud of a boat where people are sitting on the boat and an individual decides to bore a hole underneath his seat. And everyone else goes, you plonker. Now, I have looked very hard and I haven't found the word plonker in Talmudic Hebrew, Aramaic. That's in the Masechet Del Boy. Right. So they say to him, you can't do that. And he says, well, it's my seat. I'll do what I want. Right. It's my seat. I'll do what I want under it. This is the ultimate, actually. And I mean, it's just libertarian. We know there's a strain within the Conservative Party that we call libertarians. Margaret Thatcher was in many ways a libertarian. Libertarian is don't touch what people do. Don't legislate. Let people decide. They have the dignity of their decision. This guy says, let me alone. I'll decide what I want to do. Of course, he's bringing the boat down. By doing that, the water seeps in. So here, I suppose there's something about how the statement after that is Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh. All Jews are guarantors for the other. And I'm extending that to society. We are also, in some ways, responsible guarantors for wider society. Not only us, we're not the only one in society, but we shouldn't, I believe, feel that we can live in a bubble where we don't connect to the wider society. So that's responsibility. And the other two is solidarity, standing with others, and partnership. The Talmud actually says chevruta or matuta, partnership or death, which is quite a strong thing to say, really. But I think that is a societal statement too, which means that what we're saying is not on your own. And maybe therefore I'm taking a stand in a famous philosophical discussion. Are we born as part of society, or are we born individually? Are we created as individuals and then we have to make a connection, or are we actually societal animals? And I suppose I'm going for that one in how we believe. In other words, we are born with obligations to the other. We can't shake off the fact that we have a sense of obligation to the other. Now, what about some quick statistics here as well and ideas? So look, basically, there's a difference between someone seeking asylum and a refugee. Probably a legal or a policy difference. The difference really here is that a refugee is someone who's given passage to come to this country and have right to remain here. So, for instance, in the Syrian crisis in 2000, whatever it was, 15, 16, when there was a war, the civil war started, the government opened up a pathway. The government opened up a relationship through the United Nations for vulnerable Syrians who were in refugee camps in Turkey. And so there was lists that would be drawn up by the UN. It was over 22 or 3,000 over 5 years. And these were people who flew from Turkey to Britain, and they were given refugee status. They could then work. Then 5 years later, they had to reconfirm, and after another 5 years, that's it. So that they're in. That's what you call a safe route. In other words, these people, the Syrians, didn't have to go over by a boat, right, or stow away on a van or a lorry. They came straight over here. They were flown over here. That's similar to Ukrainians, of course, and the other parallel program, which is a refugee program. In other words, you are going to, we're inviting you to come here away from danger, is the Hong Kong program, the Hong Kongese. So Syria, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, but hasn't fully worked, so I'm not even going to include that. They're refugees. Anyone else, they have to find themselves here. They have to make their way here some other way. And when they get here, they then claim asylum here. That doesn't give them right to remain. Then there is a process, right? Firstly, they're interviewed. The government will have to then say at the initial stage, do we accept you have a possible case or not? If you don't have a case, goodbye. If you do, you stay and then put a legal case forward. They will have had research done on a number of the countries, so Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Eritrea. They'll already know what's going on there for them to be able to say, you come from Iraq, you come from that region, there's some stuff going on there, the Taliban is doing this or whatever, so okay, you can have asylum here. And once they eventually get a claim accepted, they then have refugee status. So first they claim asylum, and once that asylum goes through, if it's positive, they then should get then refugee status after that. There are other terms also. Displaced person has been used a lot now. Now, a displaced person is someone who is moved from where they are, and that includes people who are internally displaced. Millions of Syrians who left their homes, but they didn't want to leave. So many people don't want to leave their country. If they're Syrian, they're Syrian. They don't necessarily. I think this is sort of like image we've got from certain politicians that, there are millions and millions of people who are desperate to come here. Many people don't want to leave their country because that's where they were generations. That's where they were. And I think I ultimately, humanitarian refugee support should be about keeping people where they live as much as possible. There's no ideal of asylum, right? It's obviously if someone needs to seek asylum, they have a right, an international right to seek asylum. But obviously it would be better for people to stay in the countries in which they live. So a number of years ago, people were trying to stow away, if you remember, on lorries, and ones and twos would get over. As smugglers developed, of course, their work, and also as the French sort of what they called the jungle, which was like French sort of camps, tented camps of asylum seekers, were basically stopped, were taken away. The boats started. And so we have this situation where tens of thousands of people go across the channel hoping they will make it, and most do. And so we had about 42,000, I think, last year, or 40-something thousand. This year it's less, but it's still 20-something, 29,000. And these are people who make it across and get to this country. These are people for which there is no safe route to do that. So they cannot get on a plane. They won't have a visa to come here, and they won't go. The government will not consider them a refugee because they're not Syrian or Ukrainian or from Hong Kong. And at the same time, the number of people in the system, so the people who are waiting for a decision as to whether they can be considered a refugee or not, is about 160, 170,000. So because the system itself is slow, understaffed, not efficient, people will get to this country, but because they are slow, the system, it can take up to 2 years before an individual will be given a status here. Now, our government, for the last 10, 15 years, its main mode of working has been to prevent people coming irregularly. So it passed a bill called the Nationality and Borders Bill a few years ago, which was the first time this definition was put into law between regular and irregular. Regular being your Syrian who is brought from a UN camp in Turkey. Thank you very much. You come over here, you'll go to Glasgow, and the council in Glasgow will look after you. Gesundheit. Irregular are people who come over in the boats. You'll probably also have cases where students, let's say, have come on a student visa, let's say from, who knows, Nigeria, and they decide that they don't want to go back and rather they'd like to claim asylum. And that's another way that happens. But net migration, which is, again, the number of people who come into the country and minus the number of people who leave the country, last year was about 700,000. Now, it was high, and the government are criticised, and people like to criticise the government for it. Okay, but at the same time, a lot of that was because of Ukrainians, Hong Kong, so it was artificially increased. The government do give a lot of visas to people for jobs. So what we've done almost is said, right, we don't want European workers. That's Brexit, isn't it? Lessen our dependence on European labour, but we then have Indians, Nigerians, and others coming and doing the job at the same time. So we're still dependent on. Right, and that's a separate question that isn't core to my work. Our work is more about the compassionate side, people who are running from persecution, not policy on migration, which is more of an economic question. I mean, if people who are migrants here for the economic reasons stop working now for a week, what would that do to the economy? I think that's a really good question to contemplate on that one. Are we dependent economically on people coming from other countries? And of course, we know that we are, and that's a big political question. But that's not clearly my question. What then happened, everyone, is that there was a movement from the Nationality and Borders Bill to the Illegal Migration Bill, and this now made it problematic to even, or impossible to even claim asylum. It meant that an irregular migrant, someone coming across the sea, was now illegal. They were now illegal, and that's against international law. In terms of the Convention on the Rights of a Refugee, human rights law, there is a right that an individual has to claim asylum. Now, the government will say, well, they've gone through other safe countries. This requirement if you've gone through another country, you should have claimed asylum there. Well, hey, you went through France. Why don't you do that? It's not clear that that's exactly what international law says. And this is probably a difference between the government and international law. You heard Suella Braverman talk like that, Rob Jenrick, that the problem is not our policy. The problem is international law itself. And that's an issue, which obviously we know has been debated. So again, the idea of this government was to create a situation where less people come, rather than create a situation where we can help people. And so it was all about deterrence. A very good example of deterrence is the Rwanda scheme, which is, to be honest, an absolute farce from a political perspective, because this scheme, imagine this scheme in Rwanda is to take 200 or 300 people who are wanting to seek asylum in this country and put them in Rwanda into their system. These people will be like, goodbye, we'll never see them again. They'll go into the Rwandan system, which, by the way, not clear works well. Ours doesn't even work brilliantly, but hey, whatever. And that we think that will then deter other people from coming over the channel. So if it doesn't deter, that's a lot of money spent, right? 400 million it will be eventually on that program. But the problem, I think, morally, is that they're using the hundreds of people they're sending to Rwanda almost as a pawn in order to deter others. If it was like a sort of a valve, because we got too many and we need somewhere else to offshore it, and they'll eventually come back to Britain, I'd understand it maybe. But just think they're going to be only sending these 200 people in order that others will go, oh, I better not make that journey. I might end up in Rwanda. I just don't think that's right, other than it being politically probably problematic and also costly as well. People should be sent back if they don't have a right if it's got to be fair, the system. So if people are coming and it's not clear that they've not reached the bar of persecution, and that's up for discussion, then yeah, I think they will be sent back. I've no problem with that at all. But it just needs to be fair. It needs to be done properly. And the other issue also is that people don't have legal support. The legal support is really, really denuded in this country. So for people who need legal support for an asylum case, and it takes a long time, it's very difficult. I've talked to Jewish lawyers and barristers, because some of these cases are 2 years. It's very hard for people to take them on pro bono. People don't want to take these cases on. So it's really an issue. What about solutions? So I'll speak for a bit more, and then if you've got any questions as well. I did say I might be half hour, but Spencer's breathing a sigh of relief that it's a lot more than that. But I don't want to overstay my welcome. I mean, 2 solutions, because you might ask. And just one thing quickly, I remember a member of my shul once said to me, Rabbi, these people coming across the channel, they're skipping the queue, he said, and that's often used. They're queue skipping, us fair Brits, right? How dare they skip the queue? I think my answer to this guy was, there ain't a queue. There's no queue, right? There is a door, and the door is open to certain people and shut to others. There's no queue. They're not skipping any queue. They have a right to seek asylum if they get here. The question is there a system which, in a sense, creates, I suppose, a queue, and is done fairly? And there's an organization who I work quite a lot with called the Refugee Council, and they talk a lot about a global refugee visa. In other words, you apply in the country you live, if you can, or where you get to. So you might get to France and apply there. You can apply online, or you can go to a British embassy and apply initially for a visa, which is an initial refugee visa. So it gives you the right to get on a plane through that visa, come to, and you'll either be allowed or not, right? Come to Britain, fly in, and then under the ward of protection of the country, I suppose, of Britain, and then have your asylum claim processed. You won't need to go through any smuggling. You won't need to go across the channel, but you'll be allowed to come. There'll be a visa. There'll be an ordered way to do it. There obviously are, technical issues. There are arguments for and against, but I think that's a very interesting thinking. And the Refugee Council also call for a fairer system, more funding in the asylum system here to reduce the waiting time to 6 months, so that by 6 months people will have a result of yes or no, a proper result. And the other thing, just to slip my mind. Yes, the other thing also is that a person who is here in the asylum system, according to our law, is not allowed to work. So if you're a refugee, you can work, of course. If you are seeking asylum, you're not allowed to work. And there are a lot of people saying we should say at least after a certain amount of time, that if you've been here 6 months in the system, you should be allowed to work. I mean, it doesn't make sense really, because if they work, surely there's economic value in the fact that they're working in terms of productivity. So why? It's part of the prevention, of course, makes it harder. The harder you make it, this government feels will be more, it will prevent more people. So a few other points here, I suppose. Number one, I feel that there is a role for the Jewish community, probably through Jewish parliamentarians, Jewish peers, Jewish leaders, to talk about this, maybe to talk about refugees in a positive way, maybe to highlight some of the cruelties of the system, so should they be able to work? I mean, an interesting example is that when someone is given a positive yes status for refugees, so I've been an asylum seeker for 9 months, I'm now allowed to stay. Good Gesundheit. It was about 5 months ago that you had 28 days to leave government accommodation. So you move from government responsibility to local council responsibility. And you were given 28 days. And if you didn't find anything, you then, of course, become destitute, homeless, and the council has responsibility. But they then reduced that to 7 days. So they were giving people who had got status, I'm celebrating. I've got, but I've now got 7 days to leave the flat or the hotel or wherever and find somewhere to live. And that's really hard. And so, for us to want to help people in that situation, I think it would be really, really amazing. I think part of this is also working against hate. There is a hate often, or a sense of othering of people who are refugees. I suppose we have to think through it ourselves. At the moment, the conflict in Gaza makes our relationship with the Muslim world very complicated. And a lot of course, those that come into our country as asylum seekers will be from Muslim countries. But that doesn't have to mean that they have all going to have very, angry, aggressive, hate-filled feelings about us. And there will be vetting systems and security systems vetted as well by the government. So we need to think of that, as well, about how we think about refugees. I believe very much about building neighborliness. The idea is that refugees should be our neighbors, people who are refugees. And we were, in a way, refugees as a people. We've been through this process of coming here from somewhere else, of hoping. And think about the Kindertransport. We think of it as a success, but actually it was obviously for those that came, but the families of those who did come were left, in Europe. So obviously at the moment we worry about growing populism. And its growth across. I don't know if anyone listens to the News Agents podcast, one of the best podcasts around. John Sopel and Emily Maitlis, they just did a investigation. Well, it was actually Lewis Goodall, who's a Daily Mirror writer, who works with them, an amazing investigation into right-wing growth in Europe. Quite frightening, but very important work, actually. We also have to look at who's on our side. What I mean by that is at the moment, especially with the conflict, we're very, very, very keen to look to people who are on our side when it comes to the conflict. Are you with us? Right? Are you with us in terms of, the anti-Hamas, anti-Palestinian Muslim extremism? And that's obviously, there's good to that. But some people will be with us who are also on the right and will have Islamophobic views. And anti-migration and anti-refugee or asylum views. I think we have to think about that, and that worries me. And the last thing I'd say is that one of our, important champions here is the chief rabbi, who believes very strongly in social responsibility. It was one of the 3 pillars of his work, his opening speech 10 years ago. Is one of his 3 pillars of his rabbinate was social responsibility. He's spoken out before for us in terms of welcoming refugees. I'm not expecting the Chief Rabbi to criticize government policy. That wouldn't be appropriate, I don't think. But he is someone who sees it. And I went with him a few years ago to the north of Greece, to a very small town called Idomeni, on the border between Greece and Macedonia. And we saw a stream of Syrian and other refugees move from, where they'd come to Greece. They'd gone up Greece and they were going into Europe. And it was the most humbling sight, where you'd sit with these people on the floor and every 15 minutes they'd open the border and another 80 would go through. Eventually Macedonia stopped, or Greece and Macedonia stopped the border, shut it, and then there was a camp. But the chief rabbi took a small group of rabbis, and I was lucky to be one of them, to see work that actually World Jewish Relief were doing there. So I will leave it at that. But I hope that's been of interest. But please do ask me questions.
Thank you very much. Would someone like to ask the first question? Well, maybe I can ask the first one to stimulate interest in the question session. Could you comment on the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, as to whether it's fit for purpose? As far as I know, it came into being quite some time ago, before the time when the world was subject to mass migration. Is it fit for purpose now, or should the law should it be modified?
Yeah, I mean, you need someone more of an expert on international law than me to answer this question. I think but I would probably say it's more fit for purpose because you need more protection. So I think more protection needs more a sense of people's rights. And so because of, rather than looking at migration, especially when it comes to conflict, as a pest, we should look at it as one of the challenges of the modern world that we need to together sort out. And so I think there needs to be more, rather moaning about, international law, there needs to be more multilateral work between governments. And that's not happened. And it's a problem of Europe. Europe is part of this problem. Europe is a really, I think we more and more realize how there are two Europes, isn't there? Or there's multiple Europes. It is a artificial and sometimes false definition. And I voted Remain, I should add, because of the importance of multilateral working. Because, we know there's differences in Europe between, East and West, but we also see the growth of populism in Austria, in Germany. Holland is just, on the edge of a far-right leader taking power. Poland has a far-right, well, it did until recently have a far-right government, but it will be back in, I'm sure, fighting for the next election, just like we know Trump is, of course, fighting in America. So I think in that context, all the more so, it's something that we need to fight for. That's what I would say, undoubtedly. It's the wrong address. I think it's a distraction. Who else?
Someone raise a hand.
Someone raise a hand, or I have to pick on my brother's father-in-law.
Right. Well, you mentioned that you're trying to get the whole of the community involved, including the Orthodox community. But if you look at the main activities within communities, often you find that, and your shores, Muswell Hill did a lot of work for refugees and supporting asylum seekers. But if you look at most Reform, Liberal, and Masorti shores, because they put the emphasis on Tikkun Olam, they tend to be have a higher interest in social issues than maybe some of the Orthodox shores. Do you think it's more of a challenge to get the Orthodox shores involved and Orthodox organisations?
I think the United Synagogue communities, if we go with the United Synagogues, are a lot better than they have been. So I think we should be positive about it. I think the nature of Reformed communities will be to put more emphasis on, as you said, what they call Tikkun Olam. But I think with the Chief Rabbi's emphasis on social responsibility, the United Synagogue had a asylum seeker drop-in at Hendon and at Woodford Forest, and now they have one again. They started post-COVID again at Hendon. That's really good. So I think the United Synagogue is on the map. There's always more to do, but I suppose, look, the nature of being Orthodox communities is we will prioritize, our education, our tefillah, communal sustainability. So I don't think this has to be a model on reform at all. But there are ways that we always have to be aware. I remember when I would speak at the, I'd get a slot at the rabbinical conference of the United Synagogue. So I was on the exec and actually given a portfolio of social action and interfaith, I think. And Rabbi Liss, who was the chair at the time, was very positive about this, and that was really good. But I used to get a slot, and I'll never forget once or twice when I would do it, Diane Binstock, who's the rabbi of St. John's Wood, right? One of the Dayanim would sit there with notes, and always say, I've got members that really think this is important. And that was a good rabbi who understood that even if it's not priority of the synagogue, but he's got, a client base within, right? Members who think this is important. And I'm sure, for instance, in your synagogue, there will be people who think this sort of thing is really important. And therefore, there needs to be a pathway for them to realize that. So, as I said, if you know any of you or other members of the synagogue were interested in befriending or coming together to do something for refugees, we would be happy at HIAS JCORE to be that conduit. And I suppose I'm in an interesting position that I have relationships with other denominational leaders in this job, and did when I was a rabbi, but certainly obviously have a good relationship with the chief rabbi and the office and and other rabbis. So that puts me in an interesting position to bridge that, as in bridge not between the denominations, but bridge to the United Synagogue communities. So so if any of you want to be involved, be in touch. We can set our group up.
No one wants to ask a question?
Either that means everyone agrees or totally disagrees. I think that's
Well, let me play devil's advocate then, and put the case that some people might put against refugees. If you think of when we had labour problems after the war, we solved it with the Windrush generation, and for a long time we have concentrated on getting low-paid immigrants into jobs that often British people don't want to do. And some people might say that the productivity gap in this country has arisen because we've relied on cheap labour rather than substituting capital, as, for example, Singapore might do, or other countries which have a labour problem. What would you say to people like that?
What is it again? So, as I said before, that's not our area. That's an economic discussion in terms of migration for the economy. So that's not what we do. At the same time, obviously, so that's clear. That's not something that we talk about. But obviously, at the same time, in terms of looking at that question, you also have to think about what people can afford here in terms of in the labour market to pay. So it's fine to be able to price people up. So that you price out migrants, but people in the industries you're talking about have to be able to afford, businesses, industry has to be able to afford those wages. So we have got very dependent on that low wage, and I don't know how to get out of it. It's not a simple decision, and certainly by putting migrants off. I mean, just the other week, I think there was some new regulations, wasn't there, about how the salary needs to be 38,000 for a migrant coming in. There was issues with marriage. Could you bring dependents over? I mean, great. But then, if you've got people that can fill those jobs, then fine. If you haven't got good training for skills in these areas, then you're going to be in trouble. So it's not easy. But that's a different economic political discussion, Spencer, than asylum and refuge.
Yeah. Right.
Great.
Right, well, I'd like to thank Rabbi David Mason for his presentation tonight and giving us an insight into the problems faced by refugees and asylum seekers in the UK and reflecting what a Jewish response to the issue raised can be.